It seems that Rastakhan's Rumble is upon us, and unfortunately I ran out of time to do the full-length, in-depth card review I was planning. But I have some visuals made up, so I figured I would just very quickly go through all the cards and give some thoughts on the better ones and the more controversial ones. I'm going to be using a 5-star rating system. The 1 stars are the cards that are offensively bad. I just wish they didn't exist so I didn't have to bother scrolling past them in the collection. The 2-star cards are probably also pretty bad, but at least sometimes you consider putting them in some decks. 2 stars is kind of like the default, because most cards in the game just aren't very good. 3-star cards are like tech cards that might end up in good decks, or cards that are very powerful in decks that end up around like tier 3, tier 4. Or sometimes the 3 stars will be cards that I think are pretty good but are currently held back by something that's going to be rotating out of standard next year. The 4-star cards I think are just pretty good and you'll see them in good decks. And the 5-star cards I think are the meta definers, just the very, very powerful ones. So first up with Druid, I think the best card they got is War Druid Lodi. I think people pretty consistently underestimate flexibility in Hearthstone cards, and this is like one of the most flexible cards ever printed. I think the thing to keep in mind is that even though the taunt, rush, and spell damage forms are all very situational, you never really feel bad just throwing down the poisonous guy. So it's not like this card's going to be rotting in your hand, and it's not like it's ever really useless in any games. So I think it's just a good card, and if you're not playing Oaken Summons, you're probably playing this. I think Hero Power Druid is probably going to be pretty bad, but I'm somewhat interested in playing a package of Savage Striker, Pounce, and maybe Claw and some sort of aggro Druid, because turn 2 Pounce Savage Striker is basically like a 2-mana backstab SI7 agent, which is very powerful. And even outside of that deck, Pounce has some applications, just like dumping your hand for Ultimate Infestation, just being generally a good board control tool. I think it's just a pretty good card. The other archetype they seem to be pushing is the Big Beast Druid, and I think Stampeding Roar is going to be a very powerful card in that deck, but I think that deck is going to be pretty low tier. And I suppose the last card I want to note in Druid is Tree Speaker. I think buffing even just like 2 treants with this is pretty insane, and I like the idea of having something that takes advantage of my treants, but isn't a full Savage Roar commitment. And I think this guy fits the bill pretty well. I'm just not sure how many treant cards I can really play to support this and not feel bad about it, but I think he's quite powerful. On to Hunter. I think the standout here is Zul'jin, the new hero card. I think you definitely play it in Spell Hunter. I think it's a buff to Spell Hunter, but I don't think you can really play it anywhere else, and I don't think it's as insane as some of the other hero cards. I've seen some people saying Secret Hunter, but I just don't think this card's powerful enough in that deck. I guess we'll go ahead and talk about the other legendary, Halazi. I think this is going to be one of the worst cards in your deck, but I think it might still make the cut. Filling your hand with random garbage is pretty decent, and the links they're pretty flexible. They always have application. They pair with like Candle Shot and Hunter's Mark to kill stuff. Pair with Houndmaster, I guess. It just seems like a decent amount of value, and you don't feel too bad about playing a 3-2. Similar to that, I guess, is Springpaw, but I do think the Springpaw is a bit better. My only problem with this is that even if I'm curving into Crackling Razormaw, I think I feel pretty bad about playing a 1-mana 1/1 on turn 1. But the card is decent value. The Rush Beasts can be paired with, Houndmaster, Hunter's Mark, that kind of stuff. Seems pretty decent. Next we have Headhunter's Hatchet. I think right now I'd rather just play Candle Shot, probably don't want to play both. But after Candle Shot rotates, I'm somewhat interested in this card, although generally 2 power weapons tend to be pretty weak. But hey, you can go face for 6 damage with this thing, so don't write it off. Then we have a couple cards that I think have been pretty overrated, Revenge of the Wild and Master's Call. Revenge of the Wild, I think 90% of the time it's going to be Ancestral Spirit and you're going to feel pretty bad about it. And Master's Call, basically in any deck that can support this, I think Houndmaster is just the better card and you can't play both. So Hunter, I don't think really got too much, but Zul'jin Spell Hunter is probably going to be a thing. Mage actually got a lot of cards that I would consider pretty fringe. They got all these elemental cards. They all seem pretty powerful in a vacuum. I'm just not super sold on Elemental Mage. Elemental Evocation is probably like one of the best cards the deck could have gotten, but I still don't really see it passing tier 3. But out of all the decks that I'm saying are like pretty good but only tier 3, I think Elemental Mage has the most potential to break out and actually be a contender in the meta. Outside of that, we've got Jan'alai the Dragonhawk. I think the card is really insane if you can support it, but supporting it is going to be the problem. I think it's powerful enough though that you're going to try it in Odd Mage, Big Spell Mage, pretty much any mage deck. I think you're going to look for an excuse to play Jan'alai. To support Jan'alai, we've got Spirit of the Dragonhawk. I don't think the card is like super powerful, but in Big Spell Mage, any minion that affects the board before Dragon's Fury can come out, I'm pretty interested in. And you can play this thing on 2, curve it into Daring Fire Eater. You get to deal 3 damage to 3 enemy minions, and with a single use of your hero power, you've turned on your Jan'alai. So I'm pretty interested in that, and I think Daring Fire Eater even has some applications outside of that. Maybe an Odd Mage, maybe even an Aggro Mage if you're just desperate for damage, but I'm not too sure about that. And overall, I'm just not too sure about Odd Mage. It might be a thing because Jan'alai is so insane, but I'm not really expecting it to be. The last card I gave kind of a decent rating to was honestly a pretty generous 3-star for Malakras. I think it's a decent value card in slow control mages. May not see play now, may not see play ever, but I think it's reasonable. Moving on to Paladin. I guess the main thing I want to talk about here is Healing Paladin. High Priest the Call is absolutely insane in that deck. I think Zandalari Templar is pretty good payoff. Flash of Light's a pretty good support card. Maybe even Bloodclaw makes it in as a support card, but I'm not sure. The thing is, I just don't see Healing Paladin really being a thing. I built the deck, felt like it was worse than Even Paladin, and yeah, I just think Even Paladin's probably a better deck. Outside of Healing Paladin, I considered putting Bloodclaw in Odd Paladin, but I think in pretty much every matchup where a 1-mana 2/2 weapon is good, Odd Paladin just already steamrolls that matchup. So I'm just not that interested in it, and taking 5 damage seems like a good way to get cheesed out by some sort of like double Happy Ghoul or double Cold Blood opener, and I'm not interested in losing favorables. And then we have this whole Tiger package. Spirit of the Tiger, Shirvala, and I guess to a lesser extent a new challenger. I tried to build a mid-range Paladin, and again I thought it was just worse than Even Paladin, but I didn't think the power level was super low, and honestly Spirit of the Tiger might even just make the cut in Even Paladin, but I'm a bit skeptical. Finally, we have Timeout. I think it's a pretty good card in some sort of combo Paladin deck with a win condition. Currently that would be, I guess, the Uther OTK deck. But I don't think that deck is going to be very good, but I definitely don't want to write off a card that makes my hero immune for a turn. And then I guess I'll just briefly say, I think Immortal Prelate is probably pretty bad because it's going to get silenced. So Paladin, a lot of like fringe things that could potentially be playable. I think even outside of Healing Paladin, the Call might just be a decent control Paladin card, because then you can heal up and get up to like 40 or whatever, and some decks just can't deal 40. But for the most part, I think we're looking at even an Odd Paladin, so get used to it. So Priest actually got some pretty good cards. First one I want to point to is Mass Hysteria. One of the problems with the class right now is it doesn't have a good AoE until turn 7. This card seems like a Brawl. Brawl is pretty decent, so I'll play it in my Priest decks. Grave Horror I think looks pretty good. Priest has like Lyra, Radiant, Shadow Visions, a lot of spells they can play to support a card like this, and I think you can probably just play it in Cloning Gallery Priest, replace the like Witchwood Grizzly, Obsidian Statue, that kind of stuff. And then we have Sandrudge and Auchenai Phantasm, 2 cards that in a vacuum I think seem pretty strong. I'm just not really sure where I'm ever going to be playing these cards, but they're definitely the kind of things I want to keep an eye on. Rogue. So the first card they got is Walk the Plank. Talk to me when Vile Spineslayer rotates out. They got a lot of pirate garbage that seems like garbage. Cannon Barrage is pretty good payoff, but I don't think just like the raw number of playable pirates is really there. Hook Tusk I think is probably a bit too slow for a pirate deck. The Serrated Tooth is pretty interesting, but I don't want to play some cheap little shitty weapon in my Hero Power Make a Weapon deck. I've seen some people say that they think Raiding Party is going to be the nuts in Kingsbane Rogue. Personally, I haven't played much Kingsbane Rogue, but between the weapon itself, 2 Shiny Finders, 2 Doomerangs, Elven Minstrels to find the Shiny Finders, other card draw, I've never really felt that I had trouble finding my Kingsbane. It was more just I died to aggro, and I don't think this really helps. And then finally, Grawl the Shark. I thought this card was hot garbage, and then I watched some other reviews, and people much better than me said they thought it was pretty good. But I'm going to stick to my guns and say this card is hot garbage. I think the deciding point for this is how good it is when you hit a 3-drop, like Hinchclan Thug, SI7 Agent, maybe a Fledgling. And I think 5 mana 5/5 Death Rattle draw a card is not a good card, so I don't think Grawl is good. And in Odd Rogue, you play like a million 1-drops. You're not going to play this in Kingsbane or Malygos or Quest Rogue. Maybe Death Rattle Rogue can support this. But even then, if you're hitting like your Mechanical Whelp or whatever, I think you feel pretty bad about it. But maybe the card is good just because sometimes you play a Odd Rogue, high roll Baku in steel games you have no business winning. I think the card kind of sucks though. So overall, I think Rogue got a bunch of garbage. Wouldn't be surprised if none of these cards see play in the next 4 months. Shaman got some pretty interesting stuff. I think the main 2 that I really want to talk about are Reign of Toads and Lickum. I think the power level of both of these cards is pretty high, and I think these 2 cards are going to carry a lot of pretty shitty Shaman decks that will be able to compete with like tier 3, tier 4, just based on the power level of these. And I think there's some consideration to playing both of these in either Shudderwalk or even Shaman. I think it probably won't end up making the cut, but since I think it's a consideration in both of those, I gave them 4 stars. And Lickum might even be powerful enough to incentivize people to play aggro Shaman, which could be real when you have 2 mana 3/3 weapon. Totemic Smash I don't think is that exciting of a card, but Arcane Shot in a deck that can make spell damage totem seems at least worth considering. Next, let's talk about the legendaries, I guess. First up is Zentimo. I originally thought this card would be pretty nuts, but then when I started looking at what I can actually do with it, I found that it was pretty situational. Hexing a big Death Rattle Hunter board is going to be pretty nuts. Rockbiter Wind Fury memes seem pretty nice. But overall I think it's pretty hard to support. But I gave it 3 stars pretty much out of respect for the power level of the card. I don't think it goes in Shudderwalk Shaman though. But maybe if you can make a Kragwa deck, you'll play Zentimo in that. I originally didn't think this card was very good. Or I should say, originally I thought this card was nuts. And then I tried to build some decks with it and didn't think it was very good. But I think I was mostly getting baited by the Spirit of the Frog, which I think is quite bad. I think you just need to play too many spells to support the Spirit of the Frog. And like, if you don't have enough stuff in each slot, sometimes you just don't draw a card, and that feels pretty bad, I think. But Kragwa I think is pretty good. And the main reason I'm into it is Unstable Evolution. So you Unstable Evolution something like 5 times, and then you play Kragwa and you get 5 Unstable Evolutions in your hand, which you can then, Unstable Evolution something 10 times with each of those after that. So I think that's just like a small 2 or 3 card package that you can throw in some sort of mid-range or aggro deck, and it just gives you so much gas. I think it's pretty insane. And I think you'll play Zentimo in that deck, because Zentimo is also pretty good with Unstable Evolution. The last card to mention I suppose is Bog Slosher. I've seen a lot of people say they think this is just better than Zola and Shudderwalk Shaman. I don't agree because I like my stuff to be in play instead of in my hand, but maybe I'm just missing something. And finally, I guess I'll just touch on Wartbringer. I think the card is pretty bad, but I saw a big poll that had this ranked as like one of the worst cards in the set, and there's definitely a bunch of stuff that sucks even more than this card. Anyway though, I'm pretty interested in the Kragwa deck. I think if it works it could be pretty fun, and it'd be nice to play against something other than Shutterwalk Shaman. And Lickem and Reign of Toads I think are going to carry some shitty Shaman decks but keep my win rate up, so I like those. Alright, let's talk about the Warlock cards. They gave us a lot of discard stuff. Discarding your cheapest thing is pretty nice, but there's just no reason to play these discard cards, I don't think. I think Reckless Dire Troll, you might just end up throwing it in Zoo as an overstated thing, and the discard on it is not too bad because you never discard your Chain Gang or your Fungalmancer or your Doomguard. If you're throwing away a Voidwalker and then can still curve out, I think that's pretty good. But even then, I'm not sure this card is better than Tar Creeper. And then you have the discard payoff card, High Priestess Jeklik. I don't think this is a good enough payoff card to make me want to actually play discard stuff, but you might just ignore the last 3 lines of text on this card and play it as a good even Warlock card, a good control Warlock card, some sort of Corpse Taker support. I think it could end up being pretty decent. And then there's Soul Warden, 6 mana 6/6, draw 3 cards. I think if this was any class other than Warlock, I'd be pretty interested in drawing 3 cards. But Warlock can't always just tap, so I'm a little bit less interested in it here. I definitely can't deny the power level of the card though, but I don't want to play any of the discard garbage, and obviously this is bad if you're not discarding cards. Then we have Shriek. I've seen a lot of people say this card is just insane, but I'm not sure that I really agree with that. Like, yeah, Volcanic Potion for 1 mana is pretty sick, but discarding the lowest cost card is kind of weird, because you usually can't play like 2 Shrieks in a turn, and if you have like Defile and Shriek, you probably have to Defile first, because Shriek discarding your second AoE seems pretty terrible. And the thing is, even if this card is super efficient, like efficient cards still have to do something, and if I'm playing Shriek against like Odd Rogue or Zoo, I think pretty often it's just not going to kill anything. So I'm not that big on Shriek. I think this card is going to see a lot more play once Defile rotates out, but if this just wasn't a good card for the next 4 months, I wouldn't be surprised. And then I guess we'll end the Warlock class with Demon Bolt. I don't think the card is very impressive, but for the most part, I just think it's better than Siphon Soul, so I think it'll see some tech play here and there. On to Warrior. It looks like Warrior actually got some pretty good stuff. First we'll touch on the Rush cards, Spirit of the Rhino and Akali the Rhino. I think Rush Warrior right now is probably like tier 4, maybe tier 3, and I think these cards do make the deck better, but probably not enough better for it to jump in the tier list. So they go in a decent deck, but not a very impressive deck. And then the other stuff to talk about is the Dragon stuff. Emberscale Drake and Smolderthorn Lancer. I think these cards are very good. They're definitely incentive to play dragons. You might even force dragons into Odd Warrior, and I think the payoff is probably just worth it. Devastate, I think, is just a pretty good card. I think I probably want to play an Odd Warrior, want to play an Odd Dragon Warrior. The only thing that I can really say bad about it is sometimes it's kind of hard to damage stuff. But you've got Dynamatic, you've got weapons, you've got small dudes like Stonehill Defender and Acolyte or whatever. And there's a new neutral card, the Dragonmaw Scorcher, I believe it's called, that you're probably going to play in a lot of warrior decks. So I think Devastate does have the support, but it might end up being bad just because it's too hard to activate. And then we've got some other dragon cards that I'm a lot less excited about. Warmaster Voon, I think if you're playing a dragon deck that can play even cards, you probably end up playing this card, but I definitely don't think he's insane. Like 4 mana 4/3 is pretty low tempo. The dragons that you're copying in your hand are probably pretty big and clunky. Any game where you actually get the chance to play all of those, I think you're just probably in a pretty good spot anyway. But the value of the card is undeniable. I'm not too embarrassed to play it on turn 4. I'm just not sure that any dragon deck is going to be allowed to play even cost cards. And finally, we'll end on the apparently very controversial Dragon Roar. I'm pretty sure this card is hot garbage, because I don't want 2 random dragons in my hand. Like, yeah, even if they're shit, they still activate my dragon cards. But what if I just play a dragon that's not shit instead of this card? Like, if I'm building a dragon deck, I can guarantee that I'm not playing 2 Crowd Roaster, 2 Primordial Drake, Ysera, Onyxia, and Deathwing. So if I want another big idiot to activate my dragons, I'll just play the next best one of those that's not already in my deck instead of this trash. This card is so much worse than Omega Assembly because your mechs in that deck have Rush, they're more flexible because they don't cost 1,000,000 mana, and even the trash ones you can combine with like Magnetic and stuff to not be terrible sometimes. Wow, Dragon Roar is hot garbage and I'm surprised that people like it. On to neutral cards. From here on out I guess we can just go in order of the interesting ones, since there's no synergies to really talk about. So I guess the first card I want to talk about here is the Saronite Taskmaster. I've seen some people who are way better than me at Hearthstone say that they think this card is quite good, but I think giving the opponent an 0-3 taunt is a really terrible drawback. You play an overstated thing, a slightly overstated thing, compared to Dire Mole. You play that so you can trade with their minions, and then you give them a thing that prevents you from trading efficiently with their minions. And like, what if they just throw a Cold Blood on it or something? I am just really not into giving my opponent stuff. People look at this card and they see Zombie Chow. This card is like not even in the same league as Zombie Chow. And Zombie Chow didn't even see play in the decks that people want to play this in. So I'm not sure like why people are excited to throw this in Odd Rogue or something. I think Zombie Chow would be a better card than this in Odd Rogue. And that's a face deck that doesn't want to heal the opponent for 5. So yeah, Saronite Taskmaster I'm going to say is pretty trash. I guess the next interesting one is Scarab Egg. You make a bunch of 1/1s which just kind of die to everything. The reason Nerubian Egg and Devilsaur Egg were good is because the thing you pulled out was like overstated and the opponent couldn't even like make any progress value trading into it or anything. The Scarab Egg, I can just like kill it with my 2-drop and then kill one of them with my 1-drop, and then they've got 2 1/1s. That's just like really unimpressive to me. Compare it to Devilsaur Egg, where if I send my 2-drop and my 1-drop into it, they just fucking die and my opponent still has like a 5-2 or a 5-1. So I don't think this card is nearly as good as that, but I've seen some people say that you just play this on turn 2 in Death Rattle Hunter and then Terror Scale Stalker it, and that's just like pretty good to get you to like turn 6, turn 8, where your deck is pretty much unbeatable. I think I'm actually starting to come around on this card a bit. I've also seen some claims that you just play it in even Shaman, but I already committed to giving it a 2, so this card sucks, don't play it. And then we have Sharkfin Fan. I don't think pirate decks are going to be a thing, and honestly even if pirate decks are a thing, I think this card has been pretty overrated since day one. Like, I'm not going to play even Rogue, there's just not nearly enough payoff to play it. And in any other Rogue deck, I want a hero power on turn 2, not play this thing. I think it's just really hard to ever get value out of this card on curve, and if you're not getting value out of it on curve, I think it's just not a good card. Next up, I want to talk about Spellzerker. I think this card is actually really good. Having +2 spell damage is pretty insane, and the state of 2-drops in Hearthstone right now is just like pretty embarrassing. Like, Aggro Mage used to play Amani Berserker, and I'm almost 100% sure this card is just better than Amani Berserker and Aggro Mage. But this might be better than Amani Berserker even in like even Paladin or something. Like, you're not always going to have the effect, but apparently a 2-3 is just good enough in some decks nowadays. And in Mage, you just like value trade with it and then cast Cinderstorm for 7. Seems pretty good to me. You can even use it as like a bootleg Cosmic Anomaly. Play it for 2, hero power it, and then you can play Shooting Star or whatever. Any redundancy on your Shooting Stars is pretty good in that deck, I think. So Spellzerker, I actually think this card is really solid. It's just a matter of like, are the decks that can play it actually competitive? Maybe, maybe not. Next up we have Banana Buffoon. I think this card is probably weak, but it does have a ton of applications. You play it in Quest Mage, Quest Paladin, any deck with Gadget Sand Auctioneer or Violet Teacher. It loads up your hand for like Mountain Giant and Twilight Drake. It does so many different things that I think it's like always going to be a card that's almost good enough, but I don't think any of the stuff it does is actually good enough. So interesting card, but probably not very good. We're going to finish off this page with the Ornery Tortoise. I think this card is actually very strong, and it's probably my favorite card in the set. Maybe I'm a little bit biased because one of my favorite decks I ever made was a Tempo Rogue back in One Night in Karazhan that played Silithid Swarmer. And this guy reminds me of my boy Silithid Swarmer, which was very powerful in that deck. So why is this guy good? He's only overstated by 1 compared to a Spider Tank, but that extra point of health means he doesn't die to Swipe, Jasper Spellstone, True Silver Champion. There's just like a lot of stuff that does 4 damage. And when I play a 3-drop on turn 3 against Druid, and it doesn't die to their typical removal, I am like really, really happy with myself. Now of course this does have a drawback, and dealing 5 damage to yourself might end up being too much, but I think in a lot of matchups if I'm Odd Rogue, I just don't give a shit about 5 of my health. I want to play this and beat him up. And in Odd Rogue, you play like so many 3-drops that I think generally in matchups where you don't want to play this, you can just play another good 3-drop. So I like the Tortoise in that deck. I also think it's pretty insane in any deck playing Houndmaster, and I'll probably try to play this in other decks as well. I think the 5 damage might be enough to hold it back, but I think if this card said deal 3 damage to your hero, I would unironically say it was the best card in the set. And even with dealing 5 damage, I think this card is really, really good. On to our second page of neutral commons. This one looks quite a bit less interesting than the first page. First up, let's talk about the Halftime Scavenger. Seems like a reasonably statted neutral healing option, which you can definitely never count out. But I think the thing to really consider with this is it's a 4-mana 3/5 stealth that just like curves into Fungalmancer, Cobalt Scalebane. I think Stranglethorn Tiger is a card that's always like pretty close to being competitive. And I think this is maybe more competitively statted than Stranglethorn Tiger. So it might just end up being a pretty good card, just ignoring the overkill effect. I'm not super sold on it, it's only 3 stars, but I think I definitely want to keep an eye on this thing. Next up is the Dragonmaw Scorcher. I think this is one of the best cards in the set, reminds me a lot of Despicable Dreadlord, and I would play Dreadlord in a lot of non-Warlock decks if I could. The dragon tag on this is also super valuable. Dragon's got a bit of a push in this set. I think this card could go a long way in making those other cards actually see play. And this is also just a pretty good neutral tech card against Odd Paladin. Like, I could even see like Odd Rogue playing this card just to do better against Odd Paladin. Basically just a very efficient, competitively statted card. Finally on this page, I want to talk about the Amani War Bear. I don't think this card is very good on its own, but I think Oondasta is very powerful. I think you're going to try to play some big beasts in a lot of decks, and I think the War Bear is going to be one of your best options. Alright, on to a new page. We've got some rares on this page, but first let's talk about Rabble Bouncer. 3 stars. I'm probably overrating this card because I love Starliner so much, and I want to have no board against Paladin on turn 7 and go double Rabble Bouncer Starliner. But honestly, I think the card is somewhat competitive. People talk about how you just play MC Tech instead, but when people are playing around MC Tech, like having just 3 minions on the board, this card is better than MC Tech because MC Tech doesn't do anything. And I think a Stegodon with +1 health is not super competitive, but competitive enough that I'm not ashamed to have it in my deck, considering that sometimes it can just cost like 1 or 2 mana instead. So really, Rabble Bouncer, I think this card is slightly underrated, but maybe I'm overrating it because I like Starliner so much. Mosh'ogg Enforcer is probably terrible, but you can consider it in an Oakheart deck that doesn't have the deck slots to play 2 Dragon Hatchers, 2 Sleepy Dragons, and 2 Primordial Drakes. Belligerent Gnome. I've seen this guy get a lot of hate, but I think he's pretty good. I think particularly in even decks, this thing is going to be active on curve pretty often, because like even Warlock you're just always tapping on turn 1. Obviously you're not going to be killing their 1-drop. And then they go 2-drop, you play the Belligerent Gnome, and in even Warlock sometimes you want a hero power instead of playing a 2-drop on turn 2 anyway. And you often want your turn 3 to be tap plus 2-drop. So in that case, like I think the Belligerent Gnome is going to be a 2-mana 2/4 taunt pretty often in even Warlock. And you'll say, they already have Vulgar Homunculus, but yeah, I'd play more Vulgar Homunculuses if I could. I think Plated Beetle is just not great in that deck, so I want to play the Gnome. But even in like even Shaman and even Paladin, you're going to Hero Power on turn 1 and make some shitty little minion that's not going to kill the opponent's 1-drop. And then they make a 2-drop, you play your Gnome. I think it's just like pretty reasonable in those decks. And in even Shaman in particular, I really don't think this card is that bad even if you don't buff it. Like 1-4 is a really good stat line for Flame Tongue Totem or Earthen Might or something like that. And outside of even decks, I think this card has some applications too. I tried really hard to find the card in this set that's going to make Questrogue the best deck in the game again, and this was the best I could come up with. It doesn't seem insane in that deck, but we all know that Questrogue is going to end up being the best deck in the game for the 4th time, and maybe this card is just the truth in that deck. I think people are sleeping on the Belligerent Gnome. I'm going to go out there and say that this card is just good. Firetree Witchdoctor. This card is definitely no Netherspite Historian. One of the main reasons Netherspite Historian was good was because in your opener you could just keep Historian and Duskbreaker, and then like the Duskbreaker activated the Netherspite Historian, and then you played the Netherspite Historian which activated the Duskbreaker, and the Firetree Witchdoctor doesn't do that. But still, 2-mana 2/2 discover a spell. This card is very competitively statted. Any dragon deck that's allowed to play 2-drops is going to want to play this card. And it even kind of makes me interested in playing some dragon decks. I've heard talk of like putting more dragons in Malygos Rogue so you can play this. I think that's pretty dumb. But this card gets me interested in playing Dragon Paladin. Because originally it just had Cathedral Gargoyle, which was not enough payoff. But I think maybe Gargoyle plus Witchdoctor is enough payoff that I want to play dragons and Paladin now. And maybe you just play even Dragon Paladin or something. So finally, I guess I have to talk about Shieldbreaker. This is probably a somewhat optimistic 3 stars. I don't actually think this card is super good, but it could be powerful in a Voidlord or Obsidian statue meta. There might be a lot of Witchwood Grizzlies running around because of Oondasta. And in general, I think people really overvalue Silence. So even if this card isn't that good, I think people will still play it in some decks. Yikes, we've got 3 1-star cards on this page. Let's try our absolute best to not talk about any of those, and start with the Untamed Beastmaster. I actually think this card is quite powerful. A 3-mana 3/4 doesn't need that much help to be competitive, especially in like odd decks where you just need so many 3-drops. And I think if you get even 1 activation out of this card, it's just worth it. I think Hunter could definitely consider playing this in their Houndmaster decks. It's kind of a bummer that it doesn't really curve into Houndmaster that well. But like, instead of getting +2/+2 with your Houndmaster, you can just get +2/+2 on turn 4 with this guy instead. I also want to consider playing this in Big Beast Druid, because curving this into Juicy Psych Melon seems pretty dank. Beyond that though, I think this card might be strong enough to make you reconsider how your other aggro decks are built. Like, I want to try just playing this in Odd Rogue. That deck already plays Dire Mole, Vicious Fledgling, King Mukla, Baku. That's a lot of beasts already. And you can cut Scalebane for like Stranglethorn Tiger or something. I don't think it's that much worse. You can play Corridor Creepers, Blink Foxes. I think I'm going to play the Tortoise in that deck. There's just a lot of beasts that are pretty good in Odd Rogue. And in the past, like, you played HenchClan Thug on turn 3, and the opponent had to kill it. Or you played Vicious Fledgling on turn 3, and the opponent had to kill it. But you had, like, your 4 must-kill 3-drops, and I think this is, like, must-kill 3-drop number 5 and 6 in that deck, potentially. It could end up just totally not being worth it, but I'm pretty interested in trying this card in Odd Rogue, as well as, like, the Druid and the Hunter, and who knows where else. Like, Dire Mole and Vicious Fledgling are just generally pretty good cards. Next up, we have another 4-star card, Snapjaw Shellfighter. Maybe a bit of an optimistic 4, but I like the card quite a bit. So, 5-mana 3/8 is actually a pretty interesting, potentially competitive stat line, but this card has text on it too. So it protects your adjacent minions. That means that can protect them from minion combat, but it can also protect them from like a flame strike or something. If you have 3 minions that get flame struck, 3 including this card, this guy I believe just takes all 12 of the damage and your other 2 minions are going to survive. I think that's pretty damn good. You can also use this as a pseudo Death Speaker to protect one of your minions and value trade that turn. The 3/8 stat line is pretty good for like Cold Blood and Fungalmancer. I think this card has a lot of applications and could end up being somewhat competitive in odd decks in particular, but maybe just in general this card ends up being pretty good. I like the Snapjaw Shellfighter. A card I'm less excited about is the Crowd Roaster. So 4 health on my 7-drop seems pretty awful. I think generally dealing 7 is not a very good number. Like, you're not killing Lich King or Mountain Giant, and anything smaller than that I think you're usually going to be overkilling by quite a bit. Unless it's a Hooked Reaver, I guess. But this card does say Dragon on it, and it's not complete garbage. So maybe sometimes you play it instead of like Primordial Drake, or you play it in an odd deck that can't play Primordial Drake or something. Finally, we're on to the last set of cards, the neutral legendaries. Let's not talk about Griftah because it's a chill Wind Yeti, and let's skip ahead to Mojomaster Zihi. So originally I thought this card was pretty good. You get to like slow down Shutterwalk Shamans. This card just beats Mechathune decks. It's good against Druid, and man, I hate Druid. But I built quite a few decks before the expansion dropped, and I only ended up putting this in like a couple of them. Like, it's powerful, but I was never really that excited about actually putting it into one of my decks. So I'm only going to give it 3 stars. I think it's kind of a tech card. Next up we have the Undatakah. So this card is obviously potentially pretty powerful depending on what death rattles you hit. But in general, I think the current card pool in Hearthstone just doesn't support this card. And even if they end up printing some better death rattles, this thing is still an 8-mana death rattle minion, which is just like so absurdly slow, and you have to have had your other death rattle minions like come into play and die already. I'm just not that into it. This card is like way too expensive to play in Death Rattle Hunter, because you can be playing Katharina or Oondasta or King Crush or anything like that at that point in the game. Zombeasts. I think the only place this really has a chance of seeing play is in Death Rattle Rogue, but even in that deck I'm not super into it. Popping it with the Necreum blade the turn you play it though does seem interesting. Next up we have Oondasta. I believe this is the only card I gave 5 stars to in the entire set, because man, the power level of this set seems low. But the power level of this card is very high. So the obvious application is you just throw this into Death Rattle Hunter and it probably makes the deck better. You recruit this thing off Katharina and you're just going to win the game. Death Rattle Hunter was arguably the best deck in the game already, and they got the best card in the set, so look forward to playing in some Death Rattle Hunters for the next 4 months, I guess. But I think this card is powerful enough that it might just be worth trying to force a package with Oondasta and some other beasts into other decks. Like, Odd Warrior already plays Baku and 2 Direhorn hatchlings, so maybe you can get away with just throwing in Oondasta and maybe like a King Mosh or an Amani War Bear or something. This card is obviously also pretty good in like Big Beast Druid, but I think a lot of decks are going to attempt to play an Oondasta package, and even if all of those fail, this card is still insane in Death Rattle Hunter. And I guess since it's a legendary, let's talk about Hakkar. Card is hot garbage. So that's all the cards in the set. Like I said, I only gave 1 5-star rating, and that was to Oondasta. I think I gave like fewer than 24 stars. Pretty decent handful of 3 stars. But man, I gave a lot of 2s, and I don't think the power level of this set is very high. I suppose I'll close with some overall thoughts on the set. I think they printed a lot of fairly interesting cards, but I think Gen and Baku, Death Knights, and Carnivorous Cube are probably going to prevent most of them from seeing play. A lot of people get criticized in card reviews for not thinking about the future meta, only thinking about what goes into the current Tier 1 decks. But the current Tier 1 decks are absolutely insane. That's why they haven't changed basically since Witchwood, and I think it's probably going to stay that way. Like, why would I bother playing Pirate Rogue when I can just play Odd Rogue? Why would I bother playing some of these greedy, slow control cards when I can just play a Death Knight and that's my entire late game? Why would I even attempt to fight for the board if my deck can't support Carnivorous Cube? So overall, despite a lot of cards that could make some pretty interesting tier 3 decks, I think the very top of the meta is probably going to end up looking pretty similar to the last expansion or two, which is fairly disappointing, so I hope I'm wrong.